Why do the people who built the world own almost nothing? That's not a riddle. It's a pattern. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The Rockefellers don't technically own their mansions. The Ford family never actually owned Ford Motor Company in the way you think they did. And if you go back far enough, you'll find that the architects of the modern financial system designed it with one principle in mind. Never hold the asset, always hold the strings. This isn't about wealth. This is about control. And the difference between those two words is the difference between being a player and being played. Let me take you back to a specific moment in time. New York City, 1929, October 24th, Black Thursday, the day the stock market didn't just fall, it collapsed. But here's the part they don't teach in schools. While millions of Americans watched their life savings evaporate like morning fog, a small group of men walked away richer than they'd ever been. Not because they were lucky, because they understood something the rest of the country didn't. They understood that ownership is a liability dressed up as success. Think about that. Ownership as liability. It sounds wrong, doesn't it? Your whole life, you've been told the opposite. Own your home, own your car, build equity, acquire assets. The American dream is painted as a series of purchases, each one bringing you closer to some mythical finish line called financial freedom. But what if that dream was designed to keep you running in place? What if the finish line keeps moving because someone else is holding the tape? The men who survived the Great Depression, who thrived during it, they knew a secret that traces back further than most people realize. It goes back to the origins of banking itself, to the merchant families of Renaissance Italy, to the money changers who figured out that the real power isn't in the gold, it's in the ledger. It's in the record of who owes what to whom, because debt, unlike gold, can be multiplied infinitely, and control, unlike ownership, can never be taken from you in a single market crash. Let me paint you a picture of what this looked like in practice. It's 1933. The country is on its knees. Unemployment sits at 25%. Breadlines stretch around city blocks. Families are living in shacks made of scrap metal and cardboard, places they called Hoovervilles, named mockingly after the president who told them prosperity was just around the corner. But in the marble halls of certain Manhattan offices, a different kind of conversation is happening. These aren't the conversations of desperate men. These are strategic sessions, cold, calculated. The topic isn't how to survive the Depression. It's how to buy America at a 90% discount. And the tool they use isn't cash. It's structure, corporate structure, trusts, holding companies, entities within entities, each one a layer of insulation between the man and the asset. Here's how it worked. Let's say you wanted to control a steel mill. The old way, the way your grandfather would have done it, was simple. You saved money. You bought the mill. You owned it. Your name went on the deed. You paid property taxes. You were personally liable if something went wrong. If the mill failed, creditors could come after everything you owned, your house, your car, your daughter's college fund. Ownership meant exposure, but the new way, the way that was perfected in the wreckage of the Depression, was different. You didn't buy the mill. You created a corporation. The corporation bought the mill. You controlled the corporation, but you didn't own it in any meaningful, personal way. Your ownership was abstracted through shares, through voting rights, through board appointments. And if the mill failed, the corporation failed. Not you. The corporation took the hit. You walked away, maybe a little bruised, but still standing, still in control of the next opportunity. Now multiply that structure. Layer it. The corporation that owns the mill is owned by a holding company. The holding company is owned by a trust. The trust is managed by a foundation. And at the center of this web sits a family, a name, pulling strings that connect to assets scattered across 3 continents. They control railroads they don't own. They direct the policies of banks that exist only on paper. They live in mansions held by entities incorporated in Delaware, a state specifically designed to make corporate ownership as opaque as possible. This wasn't taught in business schools back then because it wasn't business. It was something closer to statecraft. It was the architecture of power in an age when power was migrating from kings and presidents to balance sheets and boardrooms. Let me tell you about a man named John. Not his real name, but his story is real enough. John was born in 1908, which means he was 21 when the market crashed. His father had been a successful dry goods merchant in Philadelphia, owned his shop outright, owned the building it sat in, owned a modest home in a decent neighborhood. By 1932, he owned nothing. The bank took the shop. The city took the house for unpaid taxes. John's father died of a heart attack in 1934, and John always believed it wasn't the poverty that killed him, it was the shame of losing everything he'd built. John made a decision then. He would never own anything that could be taken from him, and he didn't. By 1955, John controlled a regional grocery chain worth millions, but if you looked up his name in property records, you'd find almost nothing. A modest apartment lease. A car registration. That's it. The grocery stores were owned by a corporation. The warehouses were owned by another corporation. The delivery trucks were leased from a third entity. John's name appeared nowhere except on a few carefully structured documents that gave him voting control. When John died in 1978, his estate paid almost nothing in taxes. Not because he was poor, because on paper, he owned almost nothing. Everything he controlled was held in structures designed to outlive him, to pass seamlessly to his children without ever triggering the mechanisms that bankrupt families and destroy legacies. This is the pattern. And once you see it in one place, you start seeing it everywhere. Look at the automotive industry. Henry Ford is remembered as the man who owned Ford Motor Company. But by the time Ford went public in 1956, the Ford family's ownership was so diffused through trusts and foundations that no single person could claim to own it in any traditional sense. Yet they controlled it absolutely. They controlled the board, they controlled the direction, they controlled the legacy. Ownership was a technicality. Control was everything. Or look at real estate, an industry built entirely on the concept of ownership. The wealthiest real estate operators in America own almost nothing personally. They control limited liability companies. They control real estate investment trusts. They control partnerships where their stake is carefully calibrated to give them decision-making power without exposing them to the full weight of liability. When a property fails, when a tenant sues, when the market turns, the entity absorbs the damage. The person behind it remains untouched. This is the game. And for most of the 20th century, it was a game played only by the people who could afford expensive lawyers and accountants who understood the labyrinth of corporate law. But here's where the story gets interesting. Here's where it stops being history and starts being something you can actually use. Because the same structures that protected the Rockefellers in 1935 are available to you right now. Not in the same scale, obviously. You're not hiding a railroad fortune, but the principle is identical. The legal mechanisms that allow a billionaire to control assets without owning them are the same mechanisms that allow a freelance graphic designer in Cleveland to protect herself from a lawsuit. The same structure that lets a hedge fund manager avoid personal liability lets a small business owner sleep at night knowing that if the business fails, his family home is safe. This isn't some esoteric wealth hack. This is fundamental infrastructure. And the fact that most people don't know about it, the fact that most people still operate under the assumption that ownership equals success, that's not an accident. That's by design. Let me explain why. The modern consumer economy depends on you believing that you need to own things. Not just believe it, but feel it in your bones as a moral imperative. Rent is throwing money away, they tell you. Leasing is for suckers. Real adults own their cars, own their homes, own their appliances. This message is pumped into your brain from every angle. Advertisements, financial advice columns, dinner table conversations with your parents. The entire cultural apparatus is designed to make you equate ownership with dignity. But ask yourself, who benefits from that belief? Not you. You benefit from security, from flexibility, from control over your own time and choices. Ownership often works directly against those things. A mortgage chains you to a location for 30 years. A car loan forces you to keep a job you hate because you need to make the monthly payment. Ownership is expensive to maintain, expensive to insure, expensive to protect. It turns you into a custodian of stuff, constantly worried about depreciation and damage and theft. But the system loves it when you own things. Banks love it because they get to loan you money at interest. Insurance companies love it because you have to protect your assets. The government loves it because property is easy to tax and hard to hide. Retailers love it because ownership breeds more ownership. You buy the house, then you need to buy furniture. Then you need to buy a lawnmower. Then you need to buy a garage to store the lawnmower. It never ends. Meanwhile, the people at the top of this system own almost nothing personally. Their homes are held in trusts. Their cars are leased through corporate entities. Their art collections are owned by family foundations that double as tax shelters. They've structured their entire lives to maximize control while minimizing ownership. And then they turn around and sell you the opposite dream. This is the con, and it's been running for nearly a century. Now, I need to be clear about something. I'm not saying ownership is always bad. I'm not advocating for some kind of neo-feudal system where nobody owns anything and we're all just renting from corporate overlords. That's a different nightmare, and it's one we're already sliding toward. What I'm saying is that ownership should be a strategic choice, not an automatic reflex. You should own things that appreciate in value or generate income. You should own things that give you genuine freedom or joy. But you shouldn't own things just because you've been told that's what adults do. And more importantly, you should understand the tools that allow you to control assets without the burden and liability of direct ownership. Because those tools exist. They're legal. They're accessible. And they're the reason why some families stay wealthy for generations, while others lose everything in a single lawsuit or market downturn. Let me give you a concrete example of how this works in the modern world. Imagine you're a photographer. You're good at what you do, you've built a client list, you're making decent money, but you operate as a sole proprietor, which means legally, there's no distinction between you and your business. If a client sues you because they claim you ruined their wedding photos, they're not just suing your business, they're suing you personally. They can go after your savings account. They can go after your car. They can put a lien on your house if you own one. One bad lawsuit could destroy everything you've spent years building. Now imagine instead that you operate as a limited liability company. You, personally, own nothing related to the business. The LLC owns the cameras. The LLC owns the computer equipment. The LLC signs the contracts with clients. If someone sues, they sue the LLC. And if they win, they can take everything the LLC owns, but they can't touch your personal assets. Your home is safe. Your personal bank account is safe. You've created a firewall between your livelihood and your life. This is the same principle Rockefeller used, just scaled down. It's not complicated. It's not even particularly expensive to set up. But most people don't do it because they don't think like owners. They think like employees. They think in terms of earning and spending, not in terms of structure and protection. And this is where the real divergence happens. This is where the gap between the wealthy and everyone else stops being about how much money you make and starts being about how you hold it. The wealthy think in entities. They think in layers. They understand that the goal isn't to accumulate assets under your own name like some kind of dragon sitting on a pile of gold. The goal is to control a system of entities that hold assets, generate income, and provide legal protection. You become the puppeteer, not the puppet. This mindset shift is uncomfortable for most people because it requires you to think of yourself differently. It requires you to stop seeing yourself as an individual trying to get ahead and start seeing yourself as the architect of a small, personal empire. Even if that empire is just you and a laptop and a couple of legal entities, the structure matters. The separation matters. Let me take you forward in time now. It's 1954. The war is over. America is booming. The suburbs are spreading like mushrooms after rain. Levittown houses are going up so fast you can watch a street appear in a month, and the message being sold to returning veterans and their young families is ownership. Own your home. Own your car. Own your future. The GI Bill made it possible. The VA loans made it easy. And an entire generation bought in. But at the same time, in the same country, a different kind of transaction was happening. The wealthiest families in America were doing the opposite. They were divesting personal ownership. They were moving assets into family trusts, charitable foundations, and corporate structures specifically designed to exist in perpetuity. They were building dynasties that couldn't be destroyed by estate taxes or generational stupidity. The Rockefeller Brothers Fund was established in 1940. The Ford Foundation became one of the largest philanthropic organizations in the world by the 1950s. These weren't just acts of charity. These were legal fortresses. Money went in, and it never came out, not in any way that could be taxed or seized or squandered by a wastrel grandson. And here's the kicker. These structures didn't just protect wealth. They generated influence. A foundation controls billions of dollars in assets, and those assets can be directed toward causes, research, political lobbying, social engineering on a scale that no individual could ever achieve. The foundation becomes immortal. The family name becomes immortal. The control persists long after the people who created it are dust. This is what own nothing, control everything actually means at scale. It means your power outlives you. It means you've built something that can't be dismantled by a stock market crash, or a vindictive government, or your own children's incompetence. Now, you're probably thinking, that's all well and good for billionaires, but what does it mean for me? I don't have a family fortune to protect. I'm not trying to build a dynasty. I just want to make sure I can retire without eating cat food. Fair enough. Let's bring it down to earth. The principle applies at every level. It's not about the size of the assets. It's about the structure. It's about understanding that in a world designed to extract wealth from you at every turn, your best defense is to make yourself a difficult target. You do that by separating yourself from your assets. You do that by creating legal entities that absorb risk. You do that by thinking like someone who has something to lose, even if right now you don't feel like you do. Because here's the truth. The system is set up to punish the careless and reward the careful. It doesn't matter if you're careful with $1 million or careful with 10,000. The rules are the same. The guy who holds rental property in his own name and gets sued by a tenant who slips on ice loses everything. The guy who holds that same property in an LLC loses the property and nothing else. Same asset, different outcome. The only difference is structure. This is the knowledge that gets passed down in wealthy families and never makes it to the rest of us. It's not taught in public schools because public schools are designed to produce employees, not owners. It's not taught in most colleges because colleges are in the business of selling degrees, not financial literacy. You have to seek it out yourself. You have to be curious enough to ask why the game seems rigged and then disciplined enough to learn the actual rules. And the rules are simple once you see them. Never expose yourself personally to liability if you can avoid it. Never hold appreciating assets in your own name if you can hold them in an entity. Never confuse ownership with control. And never, ever fall for the cultural messaging that tells you that accumulating stuff in your own name is the path to security. Because it's not. It's the path to becoming a target. The more you own personally, the more you have to lose. The more you have to lose, the more you have to protect. The more you have to protect, the more you have to spend on insurance, on lawyers, on sleepless nights wondering if you're one lawsuit away from ruin. The ultimate freedom isn't owning everything. It's owning nothing that matters while controlling everything that does. This is the secret. This is the pattern. And once you see it, you can't unsee it.